So I went to my first year as a camper, and I was hooked. I could never have imagined anything like that, even as a pretty young kid. Came back my second year, went on the Crappie Lake overnight. And for those of you that remember Crappie Lake, some of the guys that came later, we didn't do Crappie Lake anymore, but you had to paddle across the lake, portage through something that it was kind of too thin to paddle through, or too, you couldn't paddle through it, but you couldn't really walk on it either. It was basically just a swamp. And I went on my overnight with Mark Johnson, who you guys know as Stone. And so when we take off on this portage, it was Stone and a junior instructor and a bunch of 10, 11, 12-year-old kids. So out in front of the pack of this herd, this gaggle of people going through the woods, is Stone with a frying pan over his shoulder, kind of sauntering through the woods. And he's got a junior counselor behind him loaded down like a pack mule with the Duluth pack and all the food. And then this line of struggling kids behind trying to drag 16-foot canoes through this stuff. And so I'm in the middle of that line, and in the back is this kid who got stuck with all of the fishing rods and most of the tackle boxes. And he didn't think to walk forward, point him forward. He carried him like this. And then tried to walk through the trees and the brush and everything else. So as we're struggling along, half carrying, half dragging this line of canoes, from behind me the entire way across this portage, I could hear a constant griping. But it was this bizarre pidgin English stream of consciousness complaining that went, I don't know who, I don't know what, I need help, I need help, I quit. And that's when I met Jay Carroll. And that night we went out, and I somehow ended up in Stone's canoe, and we're paddling around the lake. We didn't know the corn trick to catch rainbow trout, or the corn trick wasn't shared with us. So we trolled those spoons and crankbaits and things like that. And I was in the front of the canoe, and Stone is back paddling, and he had his rod, and we hadn't caught crap. We hadn't seen a trout, and he had his rod kind of leaning against the thwart of the canoe, and we had almost made a complete lap around the lake. And I happened to be looking over my shoulder just in time to see Stone's rod tip bury to the water. Of course, he's got two hands on his paddle, so the tip buries, and the butt of the rod shoots 6 feet in the air and disappears. And Stone didn't even stop, didn't even break stroke, and he just said, I had a bite. And kept paddling. So we go to the camp, we do the whole campfire thing. And those are the camp fish experiences. Here's the other one. One of the kids in that group of campers was, you guys remember Ron McConicle, who would bring kids from Hospitality House. And that was, Hospitality House had another name among the staff. It was not that flattering. These were tough kids. They called it Hood House. And these were inner city kids. And one of the kids who I actually got to be friends with that week, his name was Kenny. Kenny was probably from North Minneapolis. And here's me, I grew up in a town of 1,200 people, and I grew up on a farm 15 miles away from town. I didn't get out a lot. The Twin Cities to me was the state fair. And here's this kid from inner city Minneapolis who lived a life that I could never have imagined. He was a tough kid. And that night on Crappie Lake, the loons had gathered up. Loons were having a meeting out in the middle of the lake. In South, do you remember this? There were, I don't know how many loons there were, but there was a bunch of them. And they were calling constantly. And most of us went to bed. And Kenny went, at the Crappie Lake landing where we kind of pulled up our canoes, there was a big rock. And when we went to bed, Kenny was sitting on the rock listening to the loons. When we got up the next morning, Kenny was still there. He had not gone to bed. I mean, he was just staring at the lake, listening to the loons, and he sat there the entire night. And that kid probably never had an experience like that again in his life. That was Camp Fish too. The next year, my third year, we took a canoe trip down the Boy River. and I was on a trip with Rich Ekholm and Jeff Drahota. And Jeff and I talked about this in the boat. There you go. Talked about this in the boat the other day. When we got to the campsite the first night, Jeff stuck his head in the pack that had the food, and he said something along the lines of, "You've got to be kidding me." Is he in the pack for this is 2 counselors and 8 or 10 kids for 3 days, and our food supply was pita pockets, saltine crackers, a jar of peanut butter, and 3 cans of corn. And that was it. And we had peanut butter and saltine and pita sandwiches for a couple of days, and we ate the corn. And one of the times when we ate one of the cans of corn, I was one of the last ones in line, so I got corn water. And somewhere along the way, somebody had caught a couple of rock bass in the Boy River, and I have not since, nor will I ever eat a rock bass after that. And we didn't have to cook them in or anything. It was just fried rock bass in a bare pan, stuffed in pita bread with peanut butter and some salt and onions. And it was just a nightmare, but it was a blast. Somebody flipped a canoe, and it was just one of the typical campfish trips. Something always happens. We got back to camp, and I'm a camper. I'm helping unload stuff and doing things, and Rich, as is his way, says, "I'm going to go up to the lodge." And Rich walked up to the lodge, and 15 seconds later, the screen door banged open, and the cook came out the door. There's a guy that was a cook there. Well, he only worked there 1 year. Rich went out the door behind this guy at 1,000 miles an hour and across the campsite and disappeared. And I don't know if Rich ever caught him or what happened. And I thought, wow, working here is really something. And I did start working there the next year. And Dave kind of talked about a lot of the things, what it was like to work there. So I'm not gonna go through the same kinds of things. But I will say, I worked there for quite a few years, and every year, different staff members would come and go. And you'd show up in the spring, and you'd find out so and so's not going to be back, and you'd think to yourself, this is never going to be the same. So and so's not back. What a bummer. This is not going to be the same. And you were right. It never was. But every year, somehow, some way, the directors of the camp, the people who put together the program and hired it, and just the people themselves managed to all come together. And we had a week to get to know each other at the beginning of camp most years. Every year, we managed to put together a different kind of remarkable out of this group of people from all walks of life, all shapes and sizes. And that's, that says a lot about, the quality of the people they hired and the quality of the program and the quality of the mission that it turned those people into. And now we come here and we've gone all directions. It was really a blast finding out where, people had ended up. As we kind of started to reconnect in advance of this. He couldn't be here tonight, but Jared Bradful was one guy where I looked at, got in touch with him, and he said, "Well, I'm a surgeon." And I thought, he never took a shower. How can he be no way. How can he be a surgeon? But so it's fascinating. As fascinating as that's been, finding out where everybody ended up is seeing that the opposite is true. And I got to watch this. I've watched this conversation happen a half a dozen different times since Thursday, where 2 people walk up to each other, and I know because I hear them say it. I haven't seen you in 20 years, and within 2 or 3 minutes, if you walked into that conversation, you'd think that they'd seen each other 2 weeks before. And I think that's because, wherever we've gone in life and wherever we've ended up and wherever we've been to get there, in really important ways, we are who we were here. Because a lot, we all started it. Most of us started this at a pretty formative age in our lives, young adults. Part of the downside of that is we had a completely distorted view of what it was like to work for a living. But a lot of who we eventually became, I think, came to be at Camp Fish. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that. So, and I started to try to, when I started to think about what I was going to say tonight, I really struggled to come up with the what it all means message. And I don't know what it all means, but I think I have an idea. Go back to my first overnight trip on Crappie Lake with Stone, with Mark Johnson. Fast forward to, and that was in 1982, maybe, 1982, 83, something like that, somewhere in that, long time ago. Fast forward to about 5 years ago. I'm sitting in the cabin of my late friend Jack Burns up in Morrison, Ontario. And it was the night before Halloween. We had spent the whole week up there on a fall muskie trolling trip, which we did every year. It's like 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. We got done with dinner. We're sitting around playing cards, having a drink. And somebody knocks on the door. And Jack and I looked at each other, and end of October in Morrison, Ontario, not a lot's going on. There's nobody there. So we looked at each other and thought, who in the world is knocking on the door? So Jack kind of got up and kind of gingerly walked to the door, opened it, peeked around the corner, stepped back, and this guy walked in, and I couldn't see his face because he kind of had his back to me. But it's this little short, wiry guy, and he's got a ratty camouflage jacket, and it's mostly duct tape, and he's got a stocking cap like this on the side of his head. And he turned to look at me, and as soon as I saw him, I said, Stone. And he looked at me and he said, I haven't heard that name in 20 years. Who are you? And as soon as he walked in the door, I recognized him instantly. And it happened Thursday night when I saw Tom McLaughlin walking up Dan Craven's driveway. At noon on Thursday, if you'd have said, who's your camp counselor your second year? If you'd have given me $1 million, I couldn't have told you. But as soon as I saw Tom from 50 yards away, I recognized him and remembered him. And so we come together for things like this and to fish together because of this. Stone and I and Jack sat down and talked fishing and talked camp fish, and we found out how those two knew each other. They'd known each other for 20-some years. And we had a wonderful evening visiting and telling stories, and then Stone got up and left. And after he left, we were sitting in Jack's living room in his cabin, and all over the walls of his cabin are pictures of friends of his with fish that they had caught while they were staying at his cabin. And he was looking up at the pictures, and he looked at me and he said, the people that don't do this, here's what they'll never understand. He said, fishing is the reason, but fishing is just an excuse. And I think that's Camp Fish. Fishing was the reason, but fishing was just an excuse to be there and have those kinds of experiences. And I think we're keeping up with it right now. I mean, fishing is the reason, fishing is just the excuse. We don't remember the fish, we remember the people that were there when we caught them. And I think that's what matters most, and I think that's why we're all here. So that's all I have.